Hello, I'm Madison Metropolitan School District Superintendent Joe Gothard, and today I welcome you to the very first episode of Voices of People, Purpose, Pride. Today I'm joined by Assistant Superintendent of Financial Services, Bob Soldner. Bob, thank you for joining me today on this first episode, and we are going to have a conversation about the challenging subject of school budgets. I know that a lot of the conversations that we have, I feel as though it's information that others should have. And we have times where we're having conversations in board meetings, but there's a lot that goes into budgeting for a school district, the considerations that we're making, and most certainly making sure that our community understands what it takes to put a budget together and what influences and impacts our ability to have a sustainable financial future moving forward. One of the things that I've really enjoyed in getting to know you is your knowledge of school finance in the state of Wisconsin. So I think to begin with today, if you could share your background in school finance.
Yeah, school finance, it is a complicated topic in the state of Wisconsin. I would say unnecessarily so complicated, but I've been dealing with school finance since my time at the Legislative Fiscal Bureau. I started at the Legislative Fiscal Bureau in 1990. In 1996, my assignment changed to school district finance, including the newly created revenue limits, and at the time, the creation of the three-tiered state equalization aid formula. So I've been dealing with school finance issues in that role for 2 years, staffing the legislature's Joint Finance Committee. And then in 1998, the fall of 98, I moved to the Department of Public Instruction, where I've held several different roles, from program consultant expertise on school finance to assistant superintendent for financial services at the state level. So I've been dealing with school finance since 1996.
Yeah. So Bob knows the history and people to connect with, and it's just such a wonderful partner in doing this work for somebody to help me and others understand as well. So again, I just thank you for your service since 1990, as you mentioned. But you also bring another unique perspective to this work. You're a parent of 3 graduates of MMSD as well. Share a little bit about parenting on the East Side.
Yep, the East Side Pride. Go East. About 20 years I lived on the Near East Side, right near Orton Park on Lake Monona. My sons started their educational experience. Actually, my twins were receiving services before they entered the 4-year-old kindergarten in terms of the services that were needed. But they started at Lapham, graduated from East High School. They're now in their mid-20s. I really tell people I came to Madison in 1984 to go to college as an undergraduate, and I've never left. So it includes raising my family on the East Side. So.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob. And it's always fun to hear the journeys of your boys as well. So great job, East High School and the East feeder pattern in helping along 3 wonderful Soldner boys. So let's move into a little bit about our topic. We are now in the process of forming our preliminary budget in MMSD, a multi-stage process that has lots of different inflection points based on a number of things, many times out of our control. And let's talk a little bit about school budgeting. How does MMSD develop a budget?
Yeah, it all starts with state law, how state law dictates school finance in Wisconsin, which I always tell people. Costs are really important, and that's what it's all about. The board will approve an expenditure level, but school finance really starts with revenues in the state of Wisconsin. It has since 1996 in terms of the state-imposed school district revenue limits. In the simplest terms, what revenue limits does is limits a school board's ability to collect in revenues a combination of the largest pot of state money, state general school aids, and property taxes. So there's a limit based on the number of students you have enrolled in your district that you're restricted to every year. And that limit really simply is this is your total revenue limit. They'll tell us on October 15th for the 26-27 school year, so October of 2026, what your state aid is. You subtract that from your revenue limit. That's the max property taxes the board is allowed to levy in any one year without seeking voter approval through a referendum to increase that number.
Okay, and for MMSD, is that lacking? Is the way that state funds MMSD in public schools in Wisconsin, is it lacking?
it's lacking considerably on two fronts, not only on the total revenue available, but how the state has backed away from really cost sharing in the local costs of a school district, including Madison, which I really say started about 15, 20 years ago in terms of the state backing away from their commitment to sharing those costs. The way state law is structured right now, they allow a revenue limit increase at about 2%, right? So your annual increase that state law allows without voter approval is about 2% revenues. CPI is around 3%. Health insurance, we're entering into a third year of double-digit 15 to 18% increases in our health insurance. Salaries and health insurance are over 80% of our budget, and that's increasing well above 2%. So I tell the board, we have to manage and try to have a balanced budget, matching annual expenditures to our amount of annual revenues, but know the state has set up a structural deficit. So that's where we're operating from, which makes it real difficult.
Bob just explained something really important. CPI, Consumer Price Index, although it's a fixed number that's arrived at usually in the late fall, as you heard him say, it doesn't mean that all costs operate with that index. Insurance, for example, is far above 2.63%, and other purchases and goods and supplies that we need in MMSD to operate are far above that amount as well. So let's talk about the potential impact of not having the funds necessary as you're thinking about shaping the preliminary budget. How does that impact the work that we do?
Yeah, so for the 26-27 school year, which in state law starts on July 1 of 2026, we start talking with the board in January of 2026. So 6 months in advance of the start of the school year. And really the first exercise I have is start taking a look at what is state law telling us that our revenue limit's going to be. What are some projections of our enrollment the following September, which is a critical number to calculate our revenue limits. Again, September of 2026, we have to project what our enrollments are going to be in terms of students attending our school system in January. Once you do that, you assume what state law is going to be, you calculate a preliminary revenue projection. And then after that, you start looking at what you know are going to be ongoing costs. CPI, if the board wants to stay competitive, give our employees raises that they need, that's a big part of the budget. Health insurance, I mentioned, is another large part of our budget. And for a district the size of Madison, it's pretty easy to be $30 to $35 million, bare minimum, not increasing anything, not providing any more services. So this year I told the board in January, we're going to probably have about $31 million in new revenues. And I know without spending any time at all, we have at least 30 to 35 million in costs. So we're immediately in a spot where there's just not a lot of revenues based on the amount of state aid we get in terms of operating the system.
So talked about state aid a little bit. We'll get to property taxes and referenda in a minute, but let's talk about one other big piece, driving force in trying to do this work. Viewers, many of you know that I came from another state, and I remember in my previous district understanding that special education was underfunded by $42 million. And I thought to myself, there can't be another place in the world that would underfund special education in that amount. And I was absolutely alarmed, my first spring being here and hearing from Bob that at that time, I believe our amount was $67 million in that amount. So $25 million more dollars in underfunding of special education. And as a state, almost $1 billion with a B, in underfunding for specialized services. So what that means is that we have to transfer funds from our general purpose, Fund 10, into Fund 27 to cover those costs. But this is one area that causes a lot of stress on the budget. Bob, could you walk us through a little bit about some of the impacts of that special education underfunding?
Sure. And it's big, right? You mentioned both the federal government and the state of Wisconsin have programs to reimburse us for our costs for individualized education programs. And we have to provide those services. And as you mentioned, Joe, Madison does a phenomenal job at providing those services to students and families. So what we are at right now in the 25-26 budget, we have projected we'll need about $62 million to cover the full cost of providing those services. And what that means is it's $62 million that we don't have in terms of expenditure authority and available revenues to invest in other areas, to expand 4K education. Because that is really a first must cover these costs. And $62 million is a large amount. It is.
So let's break this down a little bit further. As you and I know, and many may know, the state legislature is in session right now, hopefully picking back up after the holiday weekend. And there is a multi-billion-dollar surplus on the table. And there are a lot of different perspectives on how and where that money should be spent. One of them that school districts, and MMSD has certainly been leaders in this, are asking for is additional funding for special education. So currently, the legislature had approved a 42% reimbursement rate for this year and a 45% reimbursement rate for next year. Yet they've done that in a way that is defined as some certain. Bob, can you share with viewers what some certain versus some sufficient means?
Sure. So 25-26, this current school year, is a perfect example. The legislature, when they approved the 2-year state budget, they said they were committed to reimbursing school districts for 42% of our costs to implement the specialized services this year and 45% in 26-27. Right now, the Department of Public Instruction is estimating it will only be 35% in terms of what they're currently reimbursing. Now, in June, at the end of this year, we'll find out what the true reimbursement is. For dollar terms, in terms of the Madison Metropolitan School District, the difference between the legislature's stated public commitment to reimburse us at 42% versus 35% is $7 million, right? $7 million in the context of the conversations we've been having when we look at 26-27, it's the difference between us having the sufficient revenues in terms of state support to match our ongoing costs. Right? It puts us from deficit spending to a balanced budget. So $7 million is a small percentage on our total budget, but budgeting for schools is a very tight business in terms of identifying that revenue.
You know, and for school districts, imagine this, that you're projecting what your revenue is going to be on your best guess. And as I just shared, you know, a few blocks from here, next week or the week after, you know, decisions will be considered that could really help us. But we may not know. So it leaves school districts in this position, Bob. And how do you work with this, with the board, with the community, you know, with your team, to come up with what those projections might be, and what is the impact of being short funded or underfunded to the tune of $6 million?
Yeah, it's really difficult. Going back to special education, which our district and many other districts in the state and our organizations and families and advocates have talked to the legislature. If you commit to 42%, you can easily do that by creating a sum sufficient appropriation. In other words, we would be provided the level of aid that the state has committed to reimbursing us, which makes a big difference in terms of looking at your budget. But for instance, right now, if we budgeted the aid at 42%, and we're looking at 35% right now, we don't get this information until well after the board has approved our budget in October for the current school year. And we have employees under contract, we have commitments that we must follow through. So we're going to have the cost regardless if the state lives up to their obligations in terms of what they stated they would provide us. So it really matters looking for other areas that we can control costs, reduce our costs, but ultimately it will end up being a hit against our general fund. So instead of a $62 million transfer, it's going to be the difference that we don't receive. And our board has some cushion, not a lot, but some cushion on our Fund 10 to be able to address these one-time shortfalls in revenue.
I do think one last thing, we'll move on from special education funding. It is important to note that when the Individual Disability Education Act was passed, the federal government also committed to up to 40% reimbursement. So yes, we're asking our state to fully fund special education, but they're also making up for the lost promise of the federal government saying that they were going to cover up to 40% of the cost. I think it's important to note that as well.
True.
Let's shift into 4K. So one of the other pleasant surprises that I have in coming back to Madison almost 2 years ago now is that we have a thriving 4K enrollment at MMSD that's, you know, in the neighborhood of 1,300 students. Some in half day, some in full day, and new this year, some in 5 days a week of programming that we're expanding next year. Share with us how per pupil funding works for our kindergarten through 12th grade students and our 4K students.
Sure, that's an excellent point. It's critical for us to continue to invest in four-year-old kindergarten. State law doesn't make it easy for districts to make that commitment. Normally, you would think a child's enrolled in your district, they're attending full-time, the state would count that as one whole child. Or in school finance parlance, we say that a 1.0 full-time equivalent. So a child's enrolled, they're a student, the state views them as one full child. When it comes to 4K education, both on age distribution and our revenue limit calculation, state law says a four-year-old kindergarten, even though they may be attending every day full day or full day for 4 day, you only get to count them as 60% or 0.6 in terms of a full-time equivalent. What that means is we have costs for a full-time student, but we're only getting aid for 60% of that cost.
In addition, and again, there's guidelines for the kind of teacher ratio, staffing ratios we have to have as well. And of course, we're going to abide by those. It is an incredible investment by this community. We're grateful because we strongly believe in our 4K program, one that we want to see expanded as well in MMSD. So now to wrap us up today, I saved sometimes the most challenging for last. Let's talk about property taxes. Bob, you and I should say you received a lot of inquiries, phone calls, emails from our Let's Talk system following the release of property tax bills in Madison. Now, you and I both also did several seminars in the community when we were going to referendum in the fall of 2024. So we told our community that what we were asking for was going to increase property taxes. However, I think there's nothing quite like getting that bill in the mail and seeing the increase and some of those impacts. Talk to us a little bit about how property taxes are determined.
Sure. It all starts with revenue limits. As I mentioned, there's a calculation that the state makes every year. Each school district has a unique revenue limit calculation. It was really based on what a district was spending back in 1995. That froze your total revenues. Except for increasing on student enrollment and voters approving a referendum question to expand that authority. So that's revenue limits. And so we get that number on October 15th we'll get that number on October 15th of 2026, right? And our school year starts July 1 of 2026. So first of all, I tell people all the time, school finance and school budgeting is a lot of unknowns when you're living the reality and you should know all this information. State law tells us we don't know that until October. So the board will approve a preliminary budget in June, and then they'll come back at the October board meeting and approve the final budget for the current school year. And in this case, the 26-27 budget will be approved by the board in October of 2026. Why is it that? Because on October 15th, the state will say, this is what we believe your revenue limit is, and this is what your general aid is going to be certified that we will commit to pay you. You take that revenue limit calculation minus that aid amount, and that's the maximum property taxes a school board may levy. And so once we know that, we get that dollar amount, which is called total levy, the levy amount, and property taxes are calculated by the individual property value of the property that you own. And how much you pay is based on your percentage of the value of the total value available to tax, right? And you know that amount by taking that levy amount by the total value, and you get what's called the tax rate or the mill rate that's used to tax people based on their assessed value when they get their property tax.
On property tax bills, there is a provision or a category called SLTC, or School Levy Tax Credit.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us what the School Levy Tax Credit is, when it was created, and what its objective is?
Yeah, when it was first created, there was a couple $100 million put into the school levy tax credit that's been around for, I believe it's over 25 years. Right now, it's over $1 billion. And the school levy tax credit, in terms of what's apportioned to the taxpayers in the Madison Metropolitan School District, is based on the levy of the last 3 years that the Madison School District School Board has levied. You take that levy, 3-year average, against everybody else, every other school district. There's 420 other school districts. And the proportion of your levy, the average over 3 years compared to everyone else's, determines what the property taxpayers will get in terms of a reduction to the ultimate tax they pay. Now, so for Madison, we get a big share of the state's school levy tax credit because our shared costs are about 90% on the property taxes. But what's unfortunate about it is the way the law is set up is our board has to say, we're going to, in our case, in real dollar terms, we estimate about $85 million in the school levy tax credit. So our board has to tell the voters when they set the levy, we're actually taxing you $85 million more that you will ever end up paying, right? And so what I like to tell people is the school levy tax credit tells the school boards, you must say you're going to tax more than people actually pay, right? And for us, it's a difference. It's about 2 mills, right? $85 million. Our total levy this year that people were very concerned about, legitimately so, was $80 million increase. If I would take into effect the amount the taxpayers actually will end up paying, it's $85 million, right? So it's actually a reduction when you take the net effect of that school levy tax credit. But the law doesn't work that way. This is done after the board sets the levy, but ultimately the taxpayers never pay that. Now, saying that, it still was a large increase in terms of the property tax bill that the voters approved in fall of 2024, right?
So what is the message around property taxes and the need for a continuing referendum? What's another way that we can control property taxes but also have enough operational capacity to run successful school districts?
I believe the simplest and most straightforward is for the legislature to recognize what has made Wisconsin strong in our public education system is the state's willingness to share their tax base with the individual school boards that are running the individual school systems. It is clearly not what it used to be, and the state has backed away from sharing of their costs. And we talked about a $2.5 billion surplus right now. The legislature could have, if they wanted to, recognize that their revenue limit formula set by law is really causing structural deficit for most school districts. And normally in the past what has happened is the legislature increases the amount of state aid. And when they increase the amount of state aid, general school aids, it's an automatic reduction to the property tax under revenue limits. So for every dollar in state aid you get, it's $1 less on property taxes, right? And so the system is out of balance, and the legislature really should be attending to it.
Great. Well, Bob, thank you so much. Assistant Superintendent of Finance, Bob Soldner for the Madison Metropolitan School District. Viewers, I think you can see exactly why I highlighted his work earlier. It's been, for me, a great education in learning everything that I can about school finance so that I can best work in MMSD, work with all of you, and certainly direct and provide recommendations to our Board of Education as well. So Bob, I thank you. And thank you for tuning in to the Voices of People, Purpose, Pride. Hopefully you'll join us again soon.